Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. To start a couple of minutes early here, thank you. My name is Ian Whittaker. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and we're very pleased to welcome Mike Glennon, Mike Lofgren, and Jerome McDonald to the Council. We're very excited to partner with WBEZ on this event, and they will be recording their Worldview show here this evening. It should be airing next Monday. Aside from some musical interludes, the format this evening will be similar to our typical evening events. Conversation followed by audience Q&A. The Q&A will be both from in the room and from our platform, the address of which should be on the screen to your left. We are live streaming this evening's event, and as always we welcome social media, but please silence your phones before we begin. The views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Just one more thing about the format for tonight. After the event, copies of both of our speakers' books will be available for sale and signing from our partners at the bookseller over there. That's National Security and Double Government by Michael Glennon and The Deep State by Mike Lofgren. Finally, as the Council approaches the end of its programming year, we want to take this opportunity to thank our members for their support, which has made possible so many programs like tonight's. So turning back to this evening's program, the conversation will be moderated by Jerome McDonald, host of WBEZ's long-running global affairs program, Worldview. Jerome will introduce our guest speakers and then kick off the discussion. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jerome McDonald, Mike Glennon, and Mike Lofgren to the Chicago Council.
Nice to see everyone. Saw a lot of old friends here, and thanks to the Council for doing this. This is our first crack at doing this at the Council, and it's been a really good experience so far. If we don't screw up the program, it'll be really great. And I think we got a lead pipe cinch terrific program, and we're going to do it really like the radio program. We're going to play the theme music. I'm going to ask for applause at times. You know how good it sounds on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me when they get that applause. And so like my cue word for applause is we're recording Worldview today at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And then, a little applause. And then we can move on. And I'll need it kind of like, we're doing it in 3 15-minute chunks. So there'll be another 15-minute chunk where I need a little applause at the beginning and the end of the segments. And I think it'll be kind of obvious where it is, and it'll make it sound better. Because otherwise, why come if you're not going to get some audience applause? And then in the third section, we go to questions and answers, and we're going to probably cut like half of it out. So make your question really good, so you get on the radio. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. Did I forget anything? Is there anything else I need to tell people about doing this on the radio? Oh yeah, we're going to record 10 seconds of silence. At what point? Let's all pretend like this is some kind of secular venue, church or something, and we're going to get 10 seconds of silence now. It's really helpful for editing later. We're also going to do some retakes maybe. If I screw up this introduction, we're going to do a retake after the first 2 sections and before the question and answer. So be forewarned. All right. Whenever you want. Welcome to Worldview from WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonald. The term deep state originated in Turkey. It's often applied to Pakistan and Egypt. But now there's people who think there's a deep state in the U.S. Trump supporters think the deep state is the opposition. Others think the U.S.'s national security services are the real deep state. We'll think through the deep state, persecution, or paranoia this hour. Don't forget, you can join the conversation on Twitter at WBEZ Worldview. We're recording Worldview today at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's really great to be here, and it's great working with the council. I've had a great experience so far, and I'm excited to talk about the topic, deep state persecution or paranoia. We've got two great guests. Michael J. Glennon is a professor of international law at Tufts. He was legal counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a few years in the late 70s, and his book is National Security and Double Government. He also had a recent article in Harper's, Security Breach, Trump's Tussle with the Bureaucratic State. And this is Mike Glennon right here. And like Mike Glennon, Mike Lofgren also worked in Congress, but for lots longer, 28 years in all. The last 16 as a senior analyst on the House and Senate Budget Committees. His book is The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of the Shadow Government. Thanks for joining us, Mike Glennon and Mike Lofgren.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, one of the great things about the term the deep state is it can mean almost anything to anybody. How do you guys define the deep state? Mike Lofgren, you've got a kind of expansive version of the deep state.
Well, when I wrote The Deep State, I began to realize from all these interpretations that when you create a concept and send it out into the world, it's like sending a virus out. It infects other people, it mutates, and it comes back to you unrecognizable. Currently, I think Pat Buchanan's latest article is called Deep State Sabotaging the Trump Agenda, in which he raises the specter of an actual civil war between pro and anti-Trump factions. And he ends with a call in his usual measured tone to burn down the Bastille.
And this is similar to what's happening with Newt Gingrich or Breitbart News or Fox News. Hannity every night is talking about the deep state.
Yes, wah, wah, wah. Now, mine stands the risk of disappointing people because it's a little more banal. It's the iron cage of bureaucracy. It is simply the evolution, not a conspiracy, an evolution of behaviors in bureaucratic structures. Actually, I found much to agree with Michael Glennon's characterization because he operates on the same theme. I merely extend it further. It's not just the government, but it's big corporations. They are also operating sort of on their own compass headings, the very biggest ones, without reference to the shareholders, just as government sometimes doesn't follow the wishes of the governed.
Mike Glennon, in your book you use the term double state. You don't use the term deep state. Is that more accurate? Is there a reason? Did you feel like deep state's a good word?
I use the term double government, which is not actually my term. It's lifted actually from English jurisprudence, and it was a term used by one of the founders of The Economist magazine, Walter Bagehot, in 1867 to describe the bifurcated system that emerged in Britain. He described the evolution from a monarchy to a concealed republic by identifying one set of institutions that the public thought actually ran the government, namely the House of Lords and the monarch, and another set of institutions that, in fact, behind the scenes, did the actual work of governing, the British House of Commons, the cabinet, and the prime minister. So it seemed to me that that was it had more relevance to the American experience than Turkey or Egypt, where obviously the history and culture and politics is entirely different from the United States. And like Mike, I don't suggest that there's any conspiracy involved, but I do suggest that we did drift into a bifurcated system of government in this country in which, in the realm of national security, the national security policy of the United States is defined and managed by a group of several hundred officials who head the intelligence and military and law enforcement agencies of the United States and have largely escaped accountability by the Congress, the courts, and even the president. And unlike Britain, which moved towards a concealed republic, the United States has been moving in the opposite direction towards autocracy.
So what both of you are describing seems a little different than Egypt or Pakistan, where the deep state there is saying sometimes in a criminal conspiracy and killing people and overthrowing the government in certain instances and completely spurring the government's foreign policy in other instances. That you wouldn't say is what's going down in the U.S. right now?
I would tend to agree with that. But what we see overseas could be a harbinger of what is to come when accountability is not required, where we have cases where American citizens can be essentially executed without judicial proceedings. And now we see Trump, he's not a captive of the deep state. He's creating his own sort of deep state 2.0. He's voluntarily delegating to our military force levels in Afghanistan. They can set that. And when a president or Congress abdicates that, they're abdicating a lot. He is allowing them to set rules of engagement. So we're going down the road pretty far on that.
Mike, do you have some thoughts on that?
I think it's useful to understand the dynamic that has caused the United States, without any purpose or intention, to drift into this system of double government. And the dynamic is really fairly simple and straightforward. And it is a function of incentives that are deeply embedded in the American political system. On the one hand, the members of Congress and the judiciary and even the executive branch don't want blood on their hands if there is an attack on the United States. They want to be able to say, we defer to the experts. They don't want to be pinpointed as the decision makers, not on their watch. So there's an enormous incentive to defer to the managers of the national security bureaucracy, who in turn don't like people looking over their shoulders and kibitzing and second-guessing their judgments about lots of very technical national security issues where, after all, they correctly believe that they have the experience and the expertise to make informed judgments to protect the nation's security. So the upshot is there's been this massive transfer of power from the elected officials of the United States to the national security bureaucracy over the last 70 years, since the whole thing was basically gotten into motion by Harry Truman.
And I would add that these executive bureaucracies didn't seize it. Congress, in many respects, abdicated their own power because they didn't want to take responsibility. In the 70s, we had funding cutoffs over Southeast Asia, prohibitions to returning to Southeast Asia. They held Nixon accountable, whereas from the Beirut bombing on, under Ronald Reagan, we've seen a gradual abdication of the field by Congress.
I'm talking with Mike Lofgren, author of The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of the Shadow Government, and Michael J. Glennon, author of National Security and Double Government, and we're talking about the idea of a deep state in the U.S. Why isn't what's happening, a lot of people have argued in the past that national security policy being bipartisan is a good thing. Robert Gates, the former CIA head, former Secretary of Defense, he came out at the end of the Cold War and said that was what won the Cold War for us. We were able to maintain a foreign policy that was uniform and keeps going. And I imagine some people would argue now that That's true with the war on terror. If we want to keep going and we want to have good relations with a place like Bahrain, the military's got it going, even if the president doesn't want it to happen. Why isn't it a good thing to have a foreign policy that's kind of driving all one direction there?
Then you get a Gulf of Tonkin resolution. What was the vote, 86-2? It was only Gruning and Wayne Morse that voted against it because we all agreed.
Well, I would just add, I mean, I don't think it's entirely accurate or certainly complete to say that the job of the national security bureaucracy is to be nonpartisan. They are, of course, expected to be electorally responsive, so that when a president like Barack Obama comes along and, for example, campaigns against torture, he then takes office and directs the Central Intelligence Agency to stop engaging in torture. They're supposed to be accountable to the elected officials of the people. What they're not supposed to do is to be a check on the elected representatives of the people. Power is supposed to flow from the elected officials to the bureaucracy, not from the bureaucracy to the elected officials. If you have that system in place, you have a very different form of government, really a bureaucratic autocracy.
President Obama talked with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic about there being a playbook for presidents when they come into office, and he felt restricted by the playbook. He thought he was going against the playbook by not attacking Syria, and that was kind of the most he could do against the playbook. Do you think presidents are hemmed in like that in a way that they have only so much latitude?
He has a tremendous susceptibility to be log-rolled. We saw that on the Afghan surge in 2009. You saw this troika of Robert Gates, David Petraeus, and Hillary Clinton coming in every day and proposing, well, we've got to do this and this and this on Afghanistan. They would also testify on the Hill in ways that would subtly undercut the direction that President Obama was going in. And there were an awful lot of leaks coming out of the Department of the Army and the State Department and the Office of the Secretary of Defense to sort of pre-rig the game, as it were, and make it more difficult for Obama and Biden to do what was their initial intention.
Well, there is a playbook, and I'm happy that I used the term in my book before Obama used it. I'd like to think that he read my book. But, you know, it's exemplified in that famous comment that Madeleine Albright made to Colin Powell at a table, arguing for the use of military force. Colin, why do we have this splendid military if we're not going to use it? The reality is that there is a profoundly powerful incentive to look to the military before looking to law enforcement or diplomacy, for the simple reason that they are extremely proficient at what they do, and they're highly respected in American society. Over and over, the polls show that the American military is the most respected institution in this country, way, way above, I might add, the people's institutions like the United States Congress, which gets 6% approval ratings. So you have this dynamic in which there's an incentive to look to the military rather than other opportunities for resolving the same problem.
Where do you think the people fit into this? How do people kind of get a grip here and look at the situation and clearly, I mean, maybe they have assessed it clearly. They are not fond of their elected officials, and they don't like them right now.
Yes, but most of them don't vote. We have one of the lowest voting percentages in the advanced democracies, and part of that is public you could call it apathy or you could call it discouragement, but for whatever reason, actual participation is low compared to, say, Western Europe. And that's one of the problems. If the American people aren't really holding their elected officials accountable in that way, or if they just dismiss everything by saying all politicians are the same, well, they're not the same. If you look at their records, you can see distinct positions on distinct issues. And yes, it's difficult. It's much easier to turn on a football game than it is to know what the positions of contending candidates is, where they stand on things.
Justice David Souter, whom I have a lot of respect for, said in a speech at the University of New Hampshire recently that the single greatest problem that this country confronts is pervasive political ignorance. Pervasive political ignorance. That, more than anything else, is responsible for the belief of the public that the constitutional institutions of our government have still been managing national security policy. They've missed the fact that this massive transfer of power has occurred over 70 years. And one of the really important developments over the last few months has been that this illusion has been shattered because there is now this open rift between the national security bureaucracy and the President of the United States, which is absolutely unprecedented and will likely lead to great instability.
Michael J. Glennon is the author of National Security and Double Government. Mike Lofgren is the author of The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of the Shadow Government. We're recording the show at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Coming up after the break, we'll talk with both guests about their experiences working for Congress. I'm Jerome McDonnell, and you're listening to Worldview on WBEZ. This is Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell. We're recording the program at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and we're talking about the idea that the deep state is in the United States. I'm talking with Michael J. Glennon, the author of National Security and Double Government, and Mike Lofgren, the author of The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of the Shadow Government. Before the break, we were just talking about the rupture between the presidency right now and the security services and what might happen. And Michael J. Glennon, you've got an article in Harper's where you kind of game out what you think is going down and what you think might happen between the Trump administration and the security services.
That article was written before, I think, the most important development in that rupture occurred. And that development is the firing by Donald Trump of James Comey. When I heard news of that, I was immediately reminded of a conversation that I had 40 years ago with a high-ranking Justice Department official, and I will relate it to you because I think it's directly pertinent in answering this question. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time was conducting an investigation of the activities of foreign intelligence agencies in the United States, DINA, SAVAK, other agencies of some of our more upstanding allies, like Chile and Iran and Iraq. Iran, sorry, the Shah's secret police was Savak, obviously. And, you know, there was, in the course of this investigation, which I was deeply involved in, it became apparent that the FBI was really sitting on the stick and not making a vigorous effort to find out what these agencies were doing. They'd done some investigating, but by and large, they didn't devote nearly enough resources to investigate these activities. So I went to the Justice Department on the committee's behalf, and I met this associate of the Attorney General, and I said, you know, what's the problem over there across the street in the J. Edgar Hoover building? These people are sitting on their behinds. They ought to get out on the street and find out what these agencies are doing, some pretty heinous things, we have reason to believe, in the United States. And his response was, Mike, you got to understand how the FBI operates. The FBI is like a big dog. Almost all the time, it sleeps and sleeps and sleeps. Every now and then, somebody wakes up the big dog, and it goes after him and goes after him and doesn't stop until it gets its teeth into him. I think Donald Trump woke up the big dog.
In the article, though, in Harper's, though, you talk about how Donald Trump, if he keeps hammering away at the bureaucracy, can split the bureaucracy likes to follow orders, and the bureaucracy will follow orders again.
Quite right. And I would just say, of course, as I say in the article, I think that had Trump done it with a little adroitness and finesse, he might have been able to pull it off, following a strategy of divide and conquer, where he identified sympathetic and supportive factions within a very fragmented bureaucracy. Unfortunately for Trump, taking a meat axe to the FBI alienated a vast group of potential supporters in the FBI. So I think it's going to be much, much more difficult for Trump now to get the national security bureaucracy on his side.
Michael J. Glennon is author of National Security and Double Government. Mike Lofgren's author of The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution, and the Rise of the Shadow Government. Mike, you had such long experience in Congress. Congressional oversight, is that something that really is meaningful? Because as we've seen the thing has happen and unfold with Donald Trump here in the FBI, it seems like congressional oversight, it seems like Congress wants to has done its best to keep its mitts off.
Well, I think in Congress, the definition of oversight means overlook. There is none. And it's particularly bad with the military. It used to really rot my socks, quite frankly, when I was a staffer watching a hearing where we wanted to hear what the strategy was, what was succeeding, what was failing, what were the recommendations, what was the correlation of forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, and hear that from General David Petraeus. Instead, during opening statements, all we got was this fawning stuff, saying how great he was and thanking him for his service from people like John McCain, Joe Lieberman, and so forth. And you never really did get to any substantive questions. Or they would ask these sort of softballs like, well, how many more troops do you need? Well, you ask a general how many more troops he'll need, oh, he'll tell you.
I think Donald Trump has asked that question.
It's sort of, ask the carpenter how many more nails he needs.
You had such long experience in Congress. You were there. I mean, the United States, we did not talk about the NSA for many years. It was a thing that existed and grew and grew and grew, and nobody knew about it. Did anybody talk about it in Congress? How do you oversight something you can't even talk about publicly?
Well, that's it. And I think we had the case with General Keith Alexander a few years ago where, yeah, it was starting to get into the news, and the reason it was getting into the news was, I better be careful here, but maybe he was perjuring himself in testimony, lying to people like Ron Wyden of Oregon about what the situation really was. And the problem was that, Wyden was properly indignant about it, but they never really did get to the bottom of it. And there was no penalty for General Alexander.
Mike Lennon?
Well, Wyden was indignant about it when James Clapper, I think it's fair to say, committed perjury before the Senate Intelligence Committee by denying that the NSA was engaged in surveillance of millions of Americans. President Obama, I think, knew about or should have known that the statement was false. He let it fester for months, and it festered really until the Snowden revelations. But Mike's point is an extremely important one. You take even the zenith of congressional oversight, the Senate torture report, the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation of torture, and look at that report and read it closely. The Senate Intelligence Committee didn't know that black site prisons had been established. They didn't know that waterboarding was occurring there. They didn't know that the waterboarding was being taped. They didn't know that the videotapes were destroyed in violation of the explicit orders of the White House, by the way. So, when the 9/11 Commission described congressional oversight as being dysfunctional, that's the word of the 9/11 Commission, that's what it was referring to. In this report that the committee subsequently published, which Dianne Feinstein said was unprecedented in the recent annals of congressional oversight, the report doesn't identify, it doesn't pinpoint responsibility with respect to anybody who managed or directed this program. It doesn't identify any legal principles applicable to the activities in question. Therefore, it doesn't identify any reforms that are necessary. This is why John McCain said, with reference to this committee, clearly they have been co-opted. He's right.
That's right. I think the only two people that were clearly identified were two contract personnel who engaged in the interrogations and had no qualifications whatsoever. But I would add one other thing that the Senate Intelligence Committee didn't know was that the CIA was surveillancing their own staff.
Well, they didn't know that Frank Church, when he made his prophetic statement that this nation would cross an abyss from which there was no return if the NSA ever turned its awesome capabilities inward on our own country, Frank Church didn't know that that his phone calls, at the very moment he made that statement, his phone calls were being eavesdropped on by the NSA.
You both also point to the courts, because in theory, in a Madisonian democracy, we have a balance of power, and the courts are another branch of government that could provide some kind of redress here. Do you think, and obviously the FISA courts, the secret courts that oversee the intelligence community, everybody knows the score there, that the intelligence community gets what they want. The courts more broadly, though, is there any chance that they are going to force any kind of change on the system?
There is you will be able to come up with only a tiny handful of cases if you look for any instance in which any plaintiff challenging even the most grievous violations of his or her rights by the Bush counterterrorism policies or the Obama counterterrorism policies has had so much as his day in court, yet alone recovered a dime in damages. Why is that? Because the courts dismiss these lawsuits before they get to the merits on very technical and largely dubious jurisdictional grounds. I'll just give you one example. There are many, many more like this. The state secrets privilege, which Barack Obama campaigned against, his administration then pleaded the state secrets privilege to get cases released. Obama read about this in the New York Times, by the way, for the first time. But a classic case is the El Masri case, in which the wrong guy is picked up by the CIA working with Macedonian forces. He's brutalized for 3 weeks, threatened with murder in a hotel room if he leaves. They then take him to Afghanistan, torture him mercilessly for 4 months, and finally conclude that he is the wrong guy. They take him to the middle of nowhere in Albania and drop him on the side of a street. That's the El Masri case. We know that what I've just said is true because he went, after he was turned away from the United States District Court on state secrets grounds. The administration argued, oh, this is all classified. He then went to the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Court decided 15-0 against Macedonia and the United States and found those facts.
Mike Glennon, Mike Lofgren, do you have some thoughts about the courts?
Sure. They always defer, except in very unusual cases, they defer to the executive branch that supposedly knows what it's doing. And as Michael Glennon said, they always cook up some sort of phony issue of standing if they don't want to hear the case. A good, or rather ironic point to bring up is the whole state's privilege, secrets privilege, is based on a lie. It began in 1953 with a plane crash of a military plane, and the next of kin wanted to find out what was happening, and the Air Force said it was classified. Well, finally, 50 years later, they find out there was nothing classified about it. This was all done to protect the aircraft manufacturer from liability. So all these cases are based on a precedent which the Supreme Court itself recognizes that is fraudulent at its base.
Mike Lofgren's the author of The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution, The Rise of the Shadow Government. Michael J. Glennon's the author of The National Security and Double Government, and we're talking about the deep state in the United States. If this thing is, we're going to take a break, and after the break, we're going to have a conversation with the audience, and we'll take some questions from the audience. We're recording this program at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm Jerome McDonnell. You're listening to Worldview on WBEZ. Retake here, we're going to retake the entire beginning of the show, the big theme music, everything. It didn't record right. So this will be fun, and then we'll go to questions, and then we'll kind of redo the music again and go to questions. Wait a second, we're going to redo some stuff here. Worldview from WBEZ, I'm Jerome McDonnell. The term deep state originated in Turkey. It's often applied to Pakistan and Egypt. But now there's people who think there's a deep state in the U.S. Trump supporters think the deep state is the opposition. Others think the U.S. National Security Services are the real deep state. We'll think through the deep state, persecution, or paranoia this hour. Don't forget, you can join the conversation on Twitter at WBEZ Worldview. We're recording Worldview today at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's great to be here with people, and I'm excited to talk about the topic deep state, persecution, or paranoia. We've got great guests. Michael J. Glennon is professor of international law at Tufts. He was legal counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a few years in the late 70s. His book is National Security and Double Government. A recent article in Harper's is Security Breach, Trump's Tussle with the Bureaucratic State. And like Mike Glennon, Mike Lofgren also worked in Congress, but for lots longer, 28 years in all, the last 16 as a senior analyst on the House and Senate Budget Committees. His book is The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of the Shadow Government. Thank you both for joining us. I wanted to ask, first of all, about the definition of a deep state. The phrase is one that's can kind of fit anything into it. How do you guys define the deep state?
We're good. Thank you.
Thank you. Making it work hard. So now we're going to play a little theme music, and we'll come back and we'll take some questions. This is Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell. We're recording the program at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and we're talking about the deep state with Michael J. Glennon, the author of National Security and Double Government, and Mike Lofgren, the author of The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution, and the Rise of the Shadow Government. One of the fun things about doing this out at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs is we get to take questions from the audience, and it was an interesting conversation, and I saw people's hands going up before we went to the break, and we've also got a few online questions that we're going to worm in from time to time, but if you want to raise your hand now, we can fire right up. This woman in the first row here, or the third row, was the first one up with her hand. Speak right up and ask.
I'm Janice Gensler, and I recently attended the People's Summit at Erie Crown Theater a few weeks ago, and my question has to do a little bit with that. Senator Durbin, several years ago, made a statement something like the banks own Congress. And the extreme financialization of our markets, such that corporations really kind of rule our country. Does that have anything to do with the shadow government?
And Mike Lofgren talks about the more expansive deep state in his book, and he says yes.
Well, yes, in my estimation, it certainly does, because I count Wall Street in there with the military-industrial complex as having this enormous amount of influence. And the other thing is, you see retired generals end up on the boards of defense companies. I mean, the boards are practically chock full of them. There's hardly any people who are not ex-generals. It's the same way, the revolving door with you had Treasury, all the Treasury secretaries. Robert Rubin, for instance, rewrote the law abolishing Glass-Steagall so that Travelers and Citigroup could merge, Citicorp at the time. And lo and behold, he left the Treasury Department after being lauded by President Bill Clinton as the greatest Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton. and promptly became the head honcho at the merged Travelers and Citicorp, and helped preside over the 2008 crash that we all remember. So yes, this is a big problem.
Is the term political capture better than deep state when it comes to the financial stuff?
It's simply an auxiliary term, I would say. You see this in cases of financial services. You had, what was his name, Congressman Baucus, when he became chairman of the House Financial Services Committee in 2011, he said, well, some people think that the banks are working under our supervision. Well, I think we're here to serve the banks. And he certainly lived up to his word.
Do you like the term oligarchy?
Sure.
Let me just say a quick word about the very interesting question of administrative capture. How is that different from the phenomenon that I've been describing? It's very similar, as I point out in the book, but there are some important differences. Number one, irreversibility. The agencies and departments that we are talking about do not regulate truck widths or airline schedules. They hold in their power the ability to dramatically and permanently change the legal and political contours of this country. Second, they operate in such extreme secrecy that it's difficult to tell whether the accountability mechanisms that we have set up are working and whether they have been captured. And third, it's impossible to get a second opinion to evaluate their risk assessment because all the information is classified and they operate under an incentive to inflate the risks. If they overestimate the risk, what's the penalty? More manpower, bigger budget. If they underestimate the risk, and overestimating the risk causes somebody else to pick up the tab, the elected representatives of the people who have to raise taxes to do that. So that's the dynamic that occurs, and that's one of the principal reasons that this massive transfer of power has occurred.
Let's take another question. Sir, you're quick with a hand there.
Hi, name is Raki Kipka. Given all the information that you've just presented, given the things that the educated public to some degree has more or less knowledge of, i.e. corporations having their hands so largely in the American government that it's hard to distinguish between an oligarchy and a democracy, with the military intelligence community being so separated from congressional oversight that they could be considered a shadow government. What's to stop us from thinking that other agencies could also have their hands in that are clearly interested in changing American politics through voting manipulation through agencies like Cambridge Analytica and other intelligence trolling corporations? What is implied here is that there's more than just one deep state. There's a very potential reality or a paradigm of multiple deep states that may or may not work together. How do we deal with that?
Now, on the issue of voting manipulation, that gets rather far afield from my core subject, but if you want to talk about another deep state in embryo, perhaps it's reached gestation right now and full birth, is Silicon Valley. Now, a lot of people talk about the surveillance by NSA. I personally, as an congressional staffer who had some insight into this stuff, feel more confident that the NSA is going to protect my privacy and my data than Google or Microsoft or Apple. You have virtually no protection with that. It's all simply commercial data, and you know, the free enterprise system is great, right? So anytime you use one of these products, your data, your personal information is used without your consent and sold to multiple people. So that's why you get 50 robocalls a day. So it makes your life hell as well.
All right. There was kind of a related online question. To what degree do you believe the double state phenomenon is playing out amongst allies across the world? Do either of you think that there are other situations like ours that scream out at you?
It's the development, it's the evolution of illiberal tendencies in liberal democracies, and I don't think any system, absent very vigorous oversight, is immune to it.
I don't know. That's a difficult question, and you'd have to take a very close look at other countries to make that charge. I am agnostic on that.
All right, let's go to another question from the audience. Sir, and try to hold the mics right up to your mouth there.
Okay, thanks. In Watergate, 10 months before Nixon was ushered out, Spiro Agnew was forced out on charges that came from him being governor of Maryland, and that had ostensibly nothing to do with Watergate. But the result of that was that when Nixon was forced out, Gerald Ford became the president, which was, at least in some respects, from the standpoint of people in the establishment, a reasonable outcome. So my question for you is sort of a game theory type. If Donald Trump has picked a fight with the intelligence establishment, which he may lose, to what extent does a President Pence represent an outcome that they're interested in? I'm sure it's not an outcome that a lot of his vocal opponents, Trump's vocal opponents, are interested in.
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think initially, before Spiro Agnew ran into problems, Nixon may well have considered Agnew the ace up his sleeve. You know, they're not going to impeach me. Look what the alternative is. I don't think that's Donald Trump's thinking at all. Quite the opposite. Mike Pence is the anti-Agnew. He is liked on Capitol Hill, and I dare say I think the Republican caucus would much prefer him as president than Donald Trump. What stands in the way is that Trump's constituency is miraculously loyal.
Mike Lofgren, do you have some thoughts about that?
No, I just totally concur with what he's saying.
Do you think that the deep state wins if Mike Pence becomes president?
I don't know. I think that the intelligence and law enforcement community would be far more likely to get what it wants from Mike Pence than from Donald Trump.
Problem is, it's not as if Trump has turned off the money spigot. There's only one way you can control these organizations. You can make all kinds of policy pronouncements. You can put prohibitions in. The only thing that gets their attention is you whack their budget 10%. That gets their attention. And Trump has not done that. I don't see, I mean, there's the obvious conflict due to certain of his own personal behaviors that got him into this mess to begin with. But in terms of his treatment of the military and the intelligence agencies, he's ladling money towards them in a way we hadn't seen since the Bush administration. He's appointing generals to heretofore civilian positions, and he wanted McMaster and Flynn to wear their military uniforms in a civilian job, which they both kind of blanched at. So it's not as if this guy is some sort of anti-military type. He's no William Jennings Bryan, let's put it that way.
Well, do you think he wants the military to trump the intelligence guys?
Well, the intelligence guys are the military guys. The problem is that organizations like the NSA are usually run by a 3-star general. And then you've got the defense intelligence agencies. Most of the intelligence agencies are actually military organizations. And that's one of the things I think ought to be changed. We ought to have civilian leadership. I mean, you could have military personnel in it, but it should have civilian leadership.
One of the online questions asked, how would you redesign the intelligence community? And of course, we just redesigned the intelligence community with Homeland Security and everything after the 9/11 attacks. But what would you do if you were to take another whack at it?
For one thing, I would orient the CIA away from covert operations. I mean, from Iran, the Bay of Pigs, and so forth, that's how this country gets into trouble. They should be a pure intelligence organization. An interesting thing that most people don't think about is in the run-up to the Iraq War, there were the 16 or 17 intelligence agencies making their estimates on whether Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. One of the agencies that was right was INR at the Department of State, which is a very small nucleus of people. And all they do is look at covert and overt intelligence. They don't do operations. And they give, because they're a very small group rather than this huge bureaucracy, they give relatively straightforward analysis. And that's what we ought to have with the CIA.
Michael Glenna?
I think that's probably a good idea. It was proposed actually, I think, just about for the first time by Harry Truman in an op-ed piece in the Washington Post, curiously 1 month after John Kennedy was assassinated. People obviously have wondered about the timing. I must say, though, there are 24 reforms like that one would, in the best of all possible worlds, support. But I question how practical they are without resolving the core problem. And the core problem is that our political system is dysfunctional. All these reforms rely upon a dysfunctional political system to fix itself. And there's no way to break that circle unless you move beyond the political system itself and get energy from the outside, and that means energy from the American people. The people really proceed in this country from a massive misunderstanding about how the framers' checks and balances are supposed to work. They think of the separation of powers system as a kind of perpetual motion machine. The framers set ambition against ambition, and these forces will keep each other in check and produce an equilibrium. That's only half the picture. The other half is that doesn't work unless it all is resting on a premise of civic virtue, which means an engaged and informed citizenry that is capable of engaging in deliberation, people who listen to each other and argue rationally, and elect people who have the public interest at heart rather than their own personal advancement. Absent that kind of civic virtue, all these reforms are going to die stillborn.
Let's go to another question. Sir, I saw your hand up there. No, the man, no, yeah, you, yeah.
Hi, my name is Richard Rupp. I'm from Purdue Northwest. And we've talked a lot tonight about liberal democracy and the deep state. And I wonder, I'm a political scientist, and there's actually a good deal of literature on that senior bureaucrats are actually more committed to liberal democracy than are the masses. And I wonder, actually, rather than thinking of the deep state as a problem, actually, particularly in the times that we're living in, given the authoritarian nature of government, that the deep state is actually potentially a positive correction in that the institutions of government, and you were just mentioning the dysfunction of government, is failing, and that senior bureaucrats need to step up and play a rather proactive role in correcting that dysfunction.
Well, you can look at the deep state in a more benign sense, in that regardless of who is the president of the day, you jolly well expect Federal Aviation Administration inspectors to come and inspect the airliner you fly on. You expect FDA people to suit up and, inspect drugs, inspect meat, that it's safe, and that doctors at the Centers for Disease Control will keep Ebola out of the country. And these are people who do it. They are patriotic according to their lights, and I praise them. And that's also what Michael Glennon said correctly, that the machinery of the government should take cognizance of the political will of the electorate. On the other hand, they can't take such cognizance that they're using government resources and government time to be involved in political activities. That's why we passed the Hatch Act in 1939. It's why we had the Pendleton Act since 1883. We found out that a pure spoil system doesn't work. We need a certain level of professionalism, but that doesn't work unless we have intelligence, and I don't mean the informational intelligence of the intelligence agencies. We need cognitive intelligence on the part of the leadership of these bureaucracies and of the elected officials who are supposed to conduct oversight and rarely do. And it's a shame on the elected officials.
Michael J. Glennon, do you have some thoughts on whether the bureaucracy can be the savior?
Yes, I do. I think that would be a terrible, terrible mistake. I can see the impulse to welcome the bureaucracy, to check what some Americans view as malignant policies that are being perpetrated or could be perpetrated by someone who was, after all, elected by the people, Donald Trump. The national security bureaucracy is not responsive to the people. It is not accountable. I mean, to as I said earlier, permit the national security bureaucracy, which is found nowhere in the Constitution, to act as a check on the elected representatives of the people or the elected leader of this country would be to move to a different form of government in which Platonic guardians are legitimated and validated in saving the people from themselves. That is not a democracy.
Ma'am, you have a question here on the third row. Wait for a microphone here.
Yes, hi. My name's Ellen Corley. My question is about my concern is groups like the Project for the New American Century, the power they had, not elected, and also the influence of the media, which I believe is captured by the business CIA. William Casey, when he was with the Reagan, was involved in the NGOs. And basically, we're dealing with the information we're given is the only thing people can vote on. And, there just seems to be a very sinister, frankly, kind of fascist influence that I don't know how we're going to get rid of it.
Well, we certainly have seen a corporatization of the media that's grown by leaps and bounds as newspapers have failed, and you have sort of a wild west on the internet where any conspiracy theory that somebody can throw out is taken as true, and yet the so-called responsible people of the corporate media often speak the government line or the line that big business wants. We saw just dreadful behavior by the media in the run-up to the Iraq War. And a lot of this was enabled. One of the worst pieces of legislation I ever had the displeasure to deal with was the 1996 Telecom Act. Lobbyists were all over the hill on that, and that was what enabled the concentration of media, cross-ownership of TV stations and newspapers in the same market, such as Rupert Murdoch with Post and Fox in New York. He really wanted that bill, and Newt Gingrich was determined to give it to him. And oddly enough, Newt Gingrich got the biggest advance up to that point for writing his sort of auto-hagiography. It was on a Murdoch imprint. So, consider that for what it's worth.
One of the incentives that I was talking about earlier applies also to the press, and the incentive on the part of the press is to maintain access. The press lives and dies on its access to decision makers. And to the extent that the press plays the role that many of us would like it to play as a watchdog in curbing government abuse and misconduct, those people, those reporters don't get their phone calls returned. So there's an incentive to pull punches. And you look at the softball questions that get asked on Face the Nation, for example, pick a show not randomly. The questions guarantee that you won't be embarrassed. You'll only be pressed up to a point. So please come back next Sunday morning.
Well, I would add that if there's one good thing Trump has done with relation to the press, it's he's probably put a knife through the heart of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I mean, that was incest at its worst between government and the press.
We'll take a couple more questions here. And is there somebody in the back of the room with a question? Let's go to that young man back there. Yeah.
How's it going? Thank you for coming to speak with us. So I have a question. How much did 9/11 change things? Because it was said earlier that the military guys are now the intelligence guys. They're basically the same thing now. And I think you see that most obviously in the drone campaign, the confluence of needing to know who are the bad guys versus how to actually take them out. So how much did 9/11 change the national security establishment as a force to be reckoned with?
Michael Glennon?
In a word, it amplified the pre-existing incentive to defer to the national security bureaucracy, because that attack was proof positive that if you get blamed for a national security calamity, your career is over. nobody in Congress, nobody in the courts wants that to happen. And to avoid that situation, you defer to the experts.
Mike Lofgren, you want to add?
Oh, absolutely. And a kind of, in popular culture, a sort of military worship started with all this, thanking people for their service. And you didn't even see it to this extent in World War II. And I think there was some level of kind of popular guilt involved because the military only affects such a very small percentage of the population. But of course now we honor the military at every seventh inning stretch at every baseball game. So it really has affected the fabric of American life.
One more question. Sir, you popped your hand up very quickly.
Hi. So you talked a little bit about how one of the problems is those who are accountable, the elected officials, not knowing what they don't know. But then you show that the solution is the voters holding them accountable. So how do you expect the voters to know what they don't know to hold the Congress accountable for what they don't know?
Good question. It's actually even worse than that. The problem is that the voters' ignorance is entirely rational. There's no reason, as political scientists have pointed out, to spend time learning about complex public policy questions if your views don't matter. It makes perfect sense to remain ignorant. And on the other side of the coin, therefore, the national security bureaucracy has, and the elected representatives of the people, have even less incentive to take into account the views of the people. This is the negative feedback loop in which the United States is now locked.
We're going to do a couple of retakes. I'm going to do a couple of quick retakes, and I'm going to say people's names a couple of times. Michael J. Glennon is professor of international law at Tufts. His book is National Security and Double Government. Mike Lofgren's a former senior analyst on the House and Senate budget committees. Michael J. Glennon, Mike Lofgren, Michael J. Glennon, Mike Lofgren. Is that all right? What else do you need? That's all we need. That's all we need. We're going to hit the music I want to thank our guests today, Michael J. Glennon, professor of international law at Tufts. His book is National Security and Double Government. A recent article in Harper's is Security Breach Trump's Tussle with the Bureaucratic State. Mike Lofgren is a former senior analyst in the House and Senate budget committees. His book is Deep State, the Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of the Shadow Government. Thanks to everyone in the audience for some great conversation and great questions. Thanks to John Macha and Ian Whitaker, Joe Palermo, and everyone here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for setting up a great program. And from the WBEZ side, thanks to Joel Meyer, Ashley Thorpe, and the usual crowd at Worldview, Steve Bynum, Julian Haida, Amber Fisher, and Vera Tan. I'm Jerome McDonnell, and you've been listening to Worldview from WBEZ.